Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bonsoir. Nous sommes très heureux d'être là pour les 10 ans d'European Lab. Je pense qu'on est dans une espèce de continuité. On prend part au débat, puisque c'est un peu de ça dont il est question. On va parler de quoi? Est-ce que c'est possible d'être afrodescendant et totalement européen également, cette double identité ou cette double culture, est-ce qu'on peut la revendiquer? Est-ce qu'on peut décider non, je ne choisis pas d'être d'ascendance africaine ou je suis européen et je ne suis pas ascendance africaine? Bien, de toutes les façons, c'est un tout petit peu de cela dont on va parler. Alors, j'ai peut-être... moi, je viens d'Afrique. Je n'ai jamais eu l'occasion.
I never had the opportunity to question myself about my black state. I never lived in the situation of my minority, but it's not the case when you live in Europe, apparently. So this is what we're going to be talking about today with our different guests. I'll start with you, Wilfried and Sunday. So I'm just going to repeat what I saw on the internet. You're a musician, you're a writer, you've had many prizes. Do I need to add something else? You're a songwriter? Have I got everything? You know, that's fine. Hello, everybody. And your last novel? What is it called? An Ocean, Two Seas, Three Continents. I haven't read that novel. But your main character, is an African priest, and it takes place during the slavery period. Well, it's a novel that looks at the trajectory of the first African ambassador to the Vatican. So it's based on a true story. So it happens in the 17th century, between 1604 and 1608. So the Pope is a representative of the... Sorry, the priest is a Catholic priest. So Congo became Christian at the end of the 16th century. So it's an interesting story because he goes from Congo to Rome. He travels via a slave boat with people destined to become slaves in Brazil. So he wasn't in the bottom of the boat, he was above because he was a priest and he was an ambassador. So there weren't blacks who were white, there were people who were slaves, there were seamen, officers, a captain and an ambassador on this boat. So when you look at the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, you can consider the concept of blackness became quite late, at the end of the 18th century. That's when it really emerged. So the transatlantic slave trade, you can look at it without thinking about the color of skin. So, Kiyémis, let me move on to you. You're an author, a poetess, a lecturer. You organize writing workshops. It's something that you're passionate about. Yes, I love organizing writing workshops on subjects that I'm passionate about, notably the question of Afrofeminism, relationship with the relationship with the body. Can I just cut you off? When you're a feminist, when you experience hate, the need for somebody in your life, these things that we hear about feminists, is it not even more difficult to be an Afrofeminist? Well, I don't know whether it's more difficult. Feminism is all about emancipation, freedom, yes, joy, more social justice. So there's a lot of anger, but there's also a lot of hope and a lot of strength, even if this is a concept that has to be questioned. Yes, it's a lot, but it's not Afrofeminism that launched sexism and racism and the question of social justice. Afrofeminism, that's what's difficult about Afrofeminism. Now, Natty, you're an author and an actress. And you've created a platform where African identities express themselves. So today we're talking about Afropean narratives, another history for Europe. It would be good if we all had the same level of information. Afropean, what are we talking about? Well, I discovered the word Afropean and Afropea in Lionel Miano's book, who lived in France for a few years. He was from Cameroon. And she described this world. Otherwise, Afropeans are Afro-descendants born in Europe, who live in Europe. And this is my own situation. I'm an Afro-Caribbean born in Paris. So I felt peaceful the first time I read this term, the first time I came across it. So it kind of reflected my political and cultural situation, and it was soothing. You know, the Martinique, Paris, France, all of that is part of me. It's part of me because France has a colonial, a slave history, and that's why I was born in France. Very quickly, I wanted to document that word. I wanted to find other Afropean histories, other stories that might inspire me. I wanted to create the platform, which is an internet site where I question people, where there are meetings, where there are analyses carried out. And that's it. Thank you. In Afropean, is it a kind of a claim for the need to change the way people look at you? I don't know whether it's a claim. I'm not sure. Above all, it's a word that doesn't define me entirely either. It's a word that makes it possible to anchor our presence here. You know, why are we in Europe? It's a way to face colonial questions, questions about the color of the skin. I'm not talking about racial questions, because they are racial questions, but you know, that's kind of a loaded, and it's a bit of a thorny issue in France to talk about that. But it's a way to anchor all of these questions in France and in Europe generally, because, you know, people always think about the United States, but there's a colonial and racial history in Europe, and, you know, it's interesting to hear more about that. So Afropean, what do you think about Afropean? What does that make you think of? Well, it's a concept that I'm not very familiar with, I have to say. And according to Marie-Julie's definition, I'm an Afropean. I didn't realize that, but I am. So it's a concept that I like it from one point of view, taking into account the unfortunate history of Europeans and Africans. So there's a real quest. And I would like to, you know, pay tribute to that quest to find the right kind of word. But in that word, Afropean, I think we've still got a separation between Africans and Europeans. I was born in the Congo, but I left the Congo at the age of 5. I went to the Île-de-France, then I lived in Germany for many years, and I now live in Lyon. I don't feel as though I'm a zebra. I don't feel as though I'm half this and half that. I think it's preferable to move away as far as possible from identities that are anchored in continental belonging. There's no race. You only have phenotypes of humanity. So I understand the approach, the Afropean approach, but I think you've got to be careful when you want to move away from stereotypes. Let's not recreate them elsewhere. So you need to be universalist. Is that what you're saying, Marie-Julie? Yes, sorry. I've lost track. No, yes, that's it. So it's not a question of mixture or zebras. There's a kind of a fusion, a melting. It's a way not to decide. It also reflects the instability that is mine. the political instability, notably, because what I'm interested in as an Afropean, and generally speaking, black people who are born in Western countries, we benefit from a Western system that allows us to have Western papers so that we can travel practically all over the world, even if, people look at us and see that we're black. But it's based on the fact that the lands of our families are still occupied by that colonial system, and that's why we're here, and that's why our parents came over. So we benefit from that system, but at the same time, that system continues to oppress us and oppress our families. They oppress us in the society in which we live, in the Western society. So there's a paradox, if you like. And I think that word, Kiyémis, whereabouts are you in that debate? Well, I think it's interesting. It's a question that I was asked a lot about, African blackness. Being Afropean, it kind of reflects our creativeness. It's a word that we don't have to buy into. I use the word black, and there are insults with this word, but Afropean, this is a word that we're inventing. So we're the ones at the end of the day who can create and make that definition. So the word comes from the grassroots, it comes from the bottom. Now, I know it's a bit complicated. You've got Afropean studies, etc. But it's, for me, the word Afropean reflects an impression, and it's not just really an impression, a wish for dissolution. It reflects a wish for dissolution. We expect lots from people who are born in European societies. We expect that there will be a dissolving, a dismantling of emotional, cultural links in terms of, the legacy of our African countries. And this word allows me to reaffirm that, to reassert it. Yes, I'm African. I didn't grow up in Africa. I wasn't born in Africa. Again, it's a question of building, of construction. I was built here. But I don't want to dissolve into European cultures, societies. It's not the reality. So identity building is not something that's specific to Afropeans. So building the European identity is completely artificial. Up until the 1950s, there were wars in Europe. And so there was a wish to build this identity. But now here we are, and I don't want to choose. I don't want to feel that I'm going to dissolve into the mass. So I'm thinking about what is written about you. You say that you're an Afropean that makes noise. So concretely, how do you do that? Well, when I speak, I'm quite loud, and I think that this question of making noise, it's about claiming the right to design. That's one concept. Thinking about one's own situation, not waiting for definitions and descriptions coming from the top, because Afropean is good, but at the same time there are so many definitions that don't necessarily mean anything, that come from diversity. What does that mean, even, diversity? From an immigrant from 15th generation, what does that actually mean?
And so in Afropean, it's true that for me, it's a sort of taking back the choice of our definition. Having said that, not all the people, the word Afropean itself is one that is criticized by people. I think that's good. It's not because we're black and here in Europe that we all think the same thing. So do you think it highlights the issue for the media? Yeah, and also another thing I would like to add, which is something very specific, I think, to France, but perhaps black people living in the Netherlands or in Spain will say the same thing, is I think when we talk about the anti-racist struggle, and the question of black people fighting for their dignity, for respect. In fact, we often refer to the United States, and ultimately that is something which is, we should remember there were two colonial empires, were France and England, and Portugal also, sorry. So I think the Afropean term enables us to address that, and in a way it makes us make a reality of this European dream of constructing ourselves without reference to the nation states. In my European, Afropean construction, it's also to go and see what's going on in England or in Spain or in Germany. And what is it that unites us, that brings us together? And if that is profoundly European. So ultimately, is there a difference in the way that Africans from sub-Saharan countries are treated in Spain or in France? Or I don't know enough, honestly, to say what the differences are. But what is clear is that there is racism in Spain. I will talk more about England, because perhaps I know that country better. There are Pan-African movements. There were Pan-African movements in the UK throughout the 20th century, but no one ever talked to us about that. We heard about Martin Luther King, and I feel nothing but respect, like anybody, I think, for the work done by Martin Luther King. But why don't we hear about the British figures who are closer to us ultimately, and there were contacts between the writers and activists in France and in the UK throughout the first part of the 20th century? Why do we never hear about that? And for me, by going out there and doing a bit research into what it means to be Afropean, that opens doors to me which no one else was going to open for me. I'm a poet. I'm Maying, who is a poet from Germany, who revealed the African feminism in Germany, and Germany's just next door. We're not aware of that. So I think that's what this term enables us to do, and it's also the title of an album by Chalu, a UK hip-hop album, who brought out from a European perspective in 1995, from an Afropean perspective. And Afropean was created by artists first. At least that's what you often see in the writings. It was created by Zermama, with Marie Doon, who was a singer and composer, who created the word to define her music. And that's interesting because we also find that in the Nubians in the 1990s, also in this English hip-hop group, who speak about this Afropean perspective. And like Kiyémis says, it enables us to have stories and a history which is closer to our French context. Afro-Belgian, Afro-British, Afro-Spanish, Afro-Dutch, and it gives us this Afropean perspective, and it shows us how each European country deals with its colonial history and with the history of slavery, and how each country has denied all this differently. For example, in the Netherlands, they've constructed themselves as a welcoming country and an open country. And there is an Afro-Dutch academic who wrote about white innocence, and who theorizes this by saying that this white innocence in the Netherlands, so the Netherlands oscillates between this denial of the whole racial question, and at the same time is producing colonial and racial violence. And this white innocence protects white privilege on these issues. And so these identities are often referred to in reference to culture. But these success stories also exist in other areas, medicine, the economy, but they're not really visible. Why? How do we elicit that? You mean Afropean successes outside the sphere of culture? Well, that's something to be done. It's true that for me, I'm perhaps more interested in the cultural aspect because I myself am an artist, and Afropean to me is a source of imagination and utopias to allow me to breathe and as Kiyémis said, and also it's not for nothing that this was created by artists. It's not by coincidence that it was created by artists. So, Wilfried, how can, in the public space, how can we elicit other kinds of Afropean success story? Very good question. Thank you. Okay. I don't know. No, just because the media often are accused, subject of accusations. The traditional media often accused of not doing enough. The new media help. That's often where we do find the success stories on the social media. But there is a reality in the traditional mainstream media. There are still a lot of people who watch the mainstream media. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's a problem of access to media, whether it be in France or Germany. So I think it wouldn't be honest of me to say that it's complicated, to say that there is a big problem. However, obviously, I'm taking a risk saying this, but perhaps also the output, the production has to be of sufficient quality and also to be supported by those it's intended for. I don't know if I'm being very clear. I think that in literature, it's the world I've been working in for 15 years in France and in Germany. Even the publishing houses are interested in having texts, and the publishers really pay very little attention to who is producing the text. What they want is to sell those texts. I think there are two things I would like to say. First, to answer Wilfried. It's true that I've often heard this question of, yeah, we'd like to have an Amanda Gorman, but we're not finding them. But what I'd like to say, first of all, is that for them to be Chimamanda and Adichie, we're going to need to accept that there are people who aren't going to be that, and there's going to be people who are average, because the reality is that people often demand that Afropeans should have a level of excellence which isn't expected of other authors. This isn't to criticize other authors, but I'm sorry. The books that come out in bookshops aren't all that good. So the quality criterion which is applied to authors of African origins is much greater than what's demanded of other people. So I think if we wait for the very finest authors to emerge, it's going to take time. The second thing I would like to say about this is that if I take the example of Wilfried, myself, I am sometimes invited in the media, and I think that over the past 5 years, things have been changing, things have been moving. But having said that, I think what is also changing is that thanks to internet, or because of internet, I don't know which, marginal voices, my impression is that there are spaces where the creation of black people, because the black people in Europe have always created. It's just they didn't necessarily have the same channels for showing that. So what I'd like to say is that the creation, which may have remained marginal in the past for lack of access, for lack of exposure, is now going to be presented more. Thinking of podcasts in France, there's no shortage of podcasts created by people of African origin. Le Chip, for example, on Arte, Luai. So there's a whole host of these podcasts. If you give me 5 minutes, I could think of at least 10 names. So I think that perhaps there's a sort of curiosity on the part of people who are less established, younger, and who are interested in going to see, because there is a sort of a sort of buzz around it, and I think that that is something that our parents and grandparents and aunts who created all kinds of films and magazines, they didn't necessarily have access to that. And I think that ultimately that is great, very exciting. At the same time, I think to myself, these people are doing things with nothing at all. It's all very, sometimes it's a bit approximate, sometimes it's very good, but what could we do if there was a fairer distribution of the human or social capital? When you see what people have done with nothing, what would it be if we allowed these people a proper chance? And what I'd also like to say as a poet or artist, I don't know if I can say artist, but never mind, as somebody who creates, let's say, is that I would like, as I said earlier, to be allowed to fail, to have the right to have a flop. Because sometimes we're worried, because if we produce a flop, the decision makers are going to say, oh, I decided with the black girl, she screwed up, I'm not trying another one. And so I think to create, there's a lot of pressure when you're creating. I would like to say, however, that it's not specific to the color of our skin. In publishing, when you produce a flop, whether you're black, blue or white, for the next book, you're gonna have your work cut out. I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, I would like to say that there are people who've produced rubbish and who get the chance to publish again. That's the reality. I don't want to quote an author. There was an author who put a smiley, an emoji on the front of his book. What black author would be allowed to put an emoji on the front of his book and to be invited in the media left, right and centre? If you're interested in literature, there are people who don't write things that are great that get published anyway. I prefer to be careful, but I don't think we should see discrimination or grounds for discrimination everywhere in literature. But when you see how when people talk about literature from the suburbs, from the periphery, the whole vocabulary that's used to describe often production by authors who are black or Arabs. And for me, that's all part of racism, in fact, this racist system. It's not to say that it's underscoring, it's a systematic view, this systematic, there's only some people who will do this, and in the literary field and in the literary industry, it's like any other capitalist industry, it is challenged by these questions. Having said that, I don't think that saying this means that all the time each decision is necessarily made by racism. That's not at all what we're saying. That's not what I'm saying. However, as you just said, Marie-Julie, claiming that it's not a possibility and a very likely possibility is quite... Yeah, no, we agree on that, yes. Could I read a poem by Kiyémis, since we're talking about literature? Afropean soul. Assimilation, dissolution. In my soul rings out an explosion. A cry cracks my body, my skin calls out Afro, our mouths sing the glories of our ancestors. To these beings that were poisoned, our souls that want to be decolonized, avid for purified air. and for a cleaner truth, leaving aside pleas and demands, let the others change the way they see to the flamboyant, complex reality of an assertive element of the diaspora of African origin, Afropean, Afrofeminist, Afro.
Ce poème, il fait résonner beaucoup de choses auprès de
Poem really resonates with you, Marie-Julie. It helps me a lot. Kiyémis' poems, like those of Laura Mianou, and also Eva Tombier's plays, who based her play on that. So it's a way of saying what we are at last and creating our experience in this French context. For me, many years, my references were Afro-American, because that's the only cultural output in which I could recognize or see myself, or where I could find answers. And I think that with Kiyémis and with Eva Doumbia, at last there is a way of saying what we are to the world from a European, French and Afropean context, and I think that is necessary. We've been talking a lot about the United States. Could we take a few moments to talk about Black Lives Matter? How does Black Lives Matter resonate with Afropean? Is it an opportunity to push further on this term of Afropeanity? Is it an opportunity, or? I'm frustrated. I feel frustrated because, in fact, no, I don't know. Frustrated is not the word. These are civil rights movements which are very inspiring, extremely rich, and all the rest. Black Lives Matter really follows on from the civil rights movements which took form and which were constructed by the Afro-Americans and Americans from the Caribbean. But having said that, what bothers you? What bothers me is that we have our own stories. That's what bothers me. And of course, in France, this does resonate with us. But I think it's important that we ask the question of why it resonates more with us, because I agree with what I said in my experience of consumption and involvement with these references to Black American artists, for lack of reference to artists from the Caribbean or from Africa or from Europe. And so I wonder, why is it that all of a sudden this is the central question? Oh, I know. Why? Because there are more Black people in Brazil, for example. So there is something, it does raise some questions, I think. Yeah. I think I'm not great at English, but in Black Lives Matter, I think it's nearly all good. It's a movement, a worldwide movement, born out of an injustice. So it is something that is fundamentally positive, but I'd like to say two things. My wife is from Normandy. Her life is also important. She's a Norman. She doesn't have black skin, but her life is important too, and we shouldn't forget that. And the second thing is that with Manu, in reaction to the aggression, to the assault on Tio in the northern suburbs of Paris, we wrote a collection of texts, Marianne and the Black Boy, and when we presented the book, it was important for me as an introduction to say that we mustn't forget that the colour of our skin does not signify, even if many people think it does, they are wrong. And let's not get this wrong. The color of skin does not show what we are as human beings. We are much more complex and richer than that. And sometimes my fear is that in slogans like this, you say Black Lives Matter. Okay, sorry, I didn't know you pronounced lives like that. It's important that we pay attention to this. I think it's important because we're talking about a specific context in the Western world, racist context in the West, and saying Black Lives Matter is because there are a lot of black people who are killed at the hands of the police because there is this systemic racism. And in the French context, we can talk about the truth for Adama, and there have also been our own things that have happened here on French soil. And it is important in the context we live to say that Black Lives Matter, because at present they don't. So for me, it's social justice to say this. It's not saying that such or such a person who is not black has less value. It's saying that black lives are worth as much as the others. And there is, for me, a principle of social equity, of social justice. And this constant principle, this humanist principle of humanism, how when things refer to black people, there's always this suspicion of division, and that's still linked with the racist system. How can I say this? For me, in my activities, I go a lot to Africa, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think it is urgent to say on the African continent that the life of human beings is important. I know this isn't politically correct, what I'm saying, but I think it's more urgent to issue a reminder about this on the African continent than in the United States. I think for a young black American who has a greater chance of being killed by the police, who is 13 or 14 years old, he's talking about his life. I understand why they say this, but at the same time I say to myself, how can I say this? I think there are people who say in Africa that people's lives do count, and that in many contexts people consider that they don't count, but I don't think they need Americans to say it, and the Americans are talking about their own American experience. If they do feel concerned for the diaspora, all the better. But I think it's a bit unfair to say to somebody, okay, it's a crisis because there are black people who are in a terrible situation because of racism and other factors, and that therefore it's a bit unfair to say that, okay, it's complicated for you, but in Africa it's worse. And what I'd also like to say is that what is it that represents such a threat? I don't understand why there is this reflex, and people are saying, as you're asserting yourselves, asserting your beauty or asserting whatever, and when you assert your pride, we're just asserting that we are part of humanity, which means that other people who aren't like us, are they scared that they might be like us, or of being pushed outside of humanity? So there have been attempts to exclude black people from humanity. Are they worrying the same thing? But over the past few years, we've been talking about this crisis of identity. Is this something that scares you? The question I'd like to ask is, are you scared of living like we do? But look, we've survived. I don't understand what you're saying. I have noted on several occasions that when there have been these debates about Black Lives Matter, there are people we say you mustn't say Black Lives Matter, we say it must say All Lives Matter. Unfortunately, the reality is we're in a world where all lives are not equal. That's just a fact. And then we have a slogan which is saying that insofar as we're in a world where not all lives are equal in certain ways, and notably regarding race, we could have another debate about race, but I'll leave that to one side for now. We're issuing a reminder of this. So I sometimes have the impression that it's as if the context disappeared and that we're in an abstract situation where all lives count in an egalitarian way. That's what I want. I want us to be in a world where we don't need to say Black Lives Matter anymore. It's an admission of failure for all of us. Collectively, a failure of society. But I know that bothers people, but to care, to treat somebody, a doctor needs to make a diagnosis, and this is the diagnosis here. And another thing I would also like to say is that often we ask people who are living these experiences to find the diagnosis and also to find the solutions. But the solutions have to be collective. It's not just black people who must find the solutions and who need to find perfect solutions in every way. Even if we're living, we mustn't essentialize things. So, they're really putting pressure on us. So what do you think that the political Europe, the European policy isn't doing enough to deconstruct prejudice? Or do we need to have Afropean lobbying to lead the way? Strong Afropean lobbying to fight this fight and to establish this message with political decision makers in Europe? I don't know yet. I know that I interviewed Olivier Bézirat, who's a Central African and Belgian author, who talked about how Afropeans need to organize as Afropeans to have our voice heard at EU level. If it happens, all well and good, but I don't know. But I would say that I would take up a standpoint as a black, not as an Afropean, I would say, and to take the Pan-African question, to really address the Pan-African question, linking it in with black people in Europe, but also in the Caribbean and in Africa. But that politically, that is the thing I think I could take up a standpoint on.
What can I say? The term black, the term African, these are terms that are not very precise. They don't really mean anything. You can't create a black lobby or an African lobby. Now, perhaps this might make sense in the United States, given their history, but in a French context, what community can you create between Muslims, people from the Sahel Desert, women, and other people who might have a completely different conception, and in the Western context as well? Yes, let's not forget that the African continent is full of diversity, linguistic diversity, religious diversity, genetic diversity, historic diversity. There's Northern Africa that's more focused on the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Central Africa is in contact with Portugal and France and has been since the 16th century, and so on and so forth. So it's really a mental construct to consider that an African exists or a black person exists. Perhaps this is in the way skinheads may see us, or in people who want to keep the peace, but in itself it doesn't exist. But it exists socially. We have social constructions, and in the Western context it has meaning. to come together as black people. There's the minority paradox as well, the minority paradox, Kauta-Uchi's paradox, to be no longer defined as something. I have to fight as that thing. So what does that mean? Well, when I define myself as a black person, then this questions the dominant power who decided that I was black. Being black is not separate from being white. It's not something that was just created. So, you know, it's we're all marked by a racialized vision of society and of the world. We have to recognize it before we can deconstruct it. You know, it's something that exists. You can't say it doesn't exist. And even, you know, the word mixed race. That shows us that we're in a racialized world. Why do we need to say it? Well, because one parent is white, the other parent is black, or one parent is black, one parent is Asian. It shows how we continue to racialize by talking about mixed race. This word, this term, mixed race, you know, it suggests that we can all live together. But no. I think it's true that Africa is an extremely diverse continent. It's true. I'm from Cameroon, and in Cameroon, there are 280 languages. So I think any kind of construct like this, well, it is that. It's a construct. And I think it's interesting to show that, you know, it's the same thing in Europe. It was the same thing in Europe. We can see this with Brexit. There are rejections. We're talking about 300 million inhabitants in Europe. They don't all have the same religion. They don't have the same history. And yet there is this utopia that exists. You know, building bridges between people in spite of their differences. And that's why I think the word black or African that were perhaps invented in a painful situation, the meeting between Europe or some countries in Europe and the continent. As far as I'm in a space that recognizes Europe as that kind of utopia, even if, you know, in a neoliberal Europe, it's not a Europe of the people, it's not, you know, but we do have this utopia all the same, it exists. Why not continue with the utopia? Why not? These are not things that are just givens, that are innate, that are natural. Any construct, any identity construction is based on something that's utopian. I mean, even France, you know, the construction of the national identity, that's shrouded also in pain. Perhaps 3 or 4 centuries ago, perhaps, well, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe 5 centuries ago, this is what I'm saying. You know, there was some kind of construction work carried out, and now it has meaning for people being French. And unfortunately, it's more of an excluding vision now. But it, you know, it makes sense. So it's important that the utopia be built on bases that make it possible to build it. But if you take the color of skin, you know, you can show solidarity about the color of skin on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but on Friday, maybe not when you go to the mosque. Just a minute, I haven't finished. It's important to check whether identity or religious belonging is not stronger than, you know, the belonging to the color of your skin. So on Friday it's finished, and then Saturday it's time to go to the synagogue, and then on Sunday it's time to go to Mass. So the construction of a utopia based on the color of skin, it only exists 4 days a week, because people go back to their neighborhoods that are fundamentally different. So it's a utopia that it doesn't work right from the start. Now, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but I think that religious belonging is much stronger than the belonging to a color of skin. Well, I think we've already made progress to begin with. Secondly, in fact, everything is a construction, and I agree with you when you point to the failures of this construction based on the color of skin. You're not wrong. Yes, there are failures. There are things missing in any kind of identity construction. But the question is, why specifically, all constructions are not stable, but why specifically the construction based on a phenotype? For me, it's a construction based on experience, and it's linked to discrimination because we're black. And perhaps, this will have no meaning in a utopia. It's what you were saying earlier on. And, it does raise questions saying that it's not possible. There are other constructions, but those other constructions are not stable either. They're just as wonky, What is the middle of the road? Well, people who, belong to some kind of religious construction, especially in Africa, they are also affected by other identities as people, identities in terms of religious practices. All constructs are fallible. Even within Islam, there are many differences. We're not one thing. I understand what you mean. However, I'm convinced so that we don't have to say that we're black anymore. We need to start with an observation. We are defined as black in Europe. I can't wait not to have to say it. However, pretending that I don't need to say it today, closing my eyes to what can explain some interactions that I might have. No. Yeah, but I can't wait to be in that world where I don't have to ask myself that question. And yeah, we would laugh about, centuries later, they define themselves as black or white. It's a bit absurd. Yes, but that absurdity has material, concrete consequences on our mind, on our body, and we have to take that into account. We don't have much time left, so we'll try and take some questions for the last 15 minutes. So let's first try and summarize what we've said. Afropean. So you're going to continue to fight so that people understand that you don't have to choose. Yes. Yes. Why am I being asked to choose at the end of the day? Yes, I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to, above all, continue to try and say to myself, well, let's just abolish sexist, racialist questions, then we can talk about something else. That's the aim. It's not just, okay, I recognize, I see myself in that. The ultimate objective is that. Maybe my great-grandchildren will say, oh, my goodness, did you have to do that? And it won't mean anything for them. That's what the objective is. Perhaps I can ask the question, who is asking you to choose? Why? We don't ask people who are of Franco-British origin to choose. Racism, it's not about choosing between your origins and the fact that you were born here. It's what are we being assimilated to? I was born here, and why? So yes, there are these questions. So we just have to be ourselves, maybe. You know, we mustn't just think black. We've understood your argument. You know, how do we live in Europe? Is it just about, you know, being ourselves and accepting injustice? No, no. We mustn't accept any kind of injustice. So this question of choice is interesting because it was at the center of my first novel. All of these stupid questions that one asks us. We shouldn't even consider this kind of question. It's a question that makes no sense. So I'm just not going to be interested in it anymore. And just to summarize, what I've heard about Afropeans, yeah, it's interesting. I'm not against it. It's something that I'm discovering. I know that I read the text. It's a great text because, you know, that's what's important at the end of the day. When I say it's a beautiful text, it means that, you know, it's something that touches something inside me. But identity supports, you know, it's not possible. It's not easy. We should all have that kind of ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've been through quite a number of themes there. Would anybody like to ask a question? Okay, well, I will continue. If we look back over history, and we think about the Roman Empire, which was an area that went from North Africa right up to Scotland. And there was no phenotype problem. Ancient Egypt, it was the same thing. There were different phenotypes. There are only Egyptologists of the 19th century who hid any kind of visual illusion to diversity in Egypt. So that's all good news, because it means that at the end of the day, 300 years ago, you know, thinking went backwards. There were tensions about skin color that are recent. So perhaps we need to not be as tense. Well, in order not to be as tense, I understand what you're saying about the Roman Empire. However, there are other things that I might say about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, I'm looking for the right words. There was, you know, it involved domination. Without talking about blacks. Even inside the Roman Empire, there were categories, people who didn't have the same rights. You know, if we don't talk about phenotypes, you know, there was identities, regional identities were crushed to the benefit of the construction of an empire. But it's good to say that. But the problem is, well, thinking back to that time, many people don't know that what we are living today is the follow-on from what happened 200, 300 years ago. You know, people are just catching on. So the common history with slavery and things, people said, oh, but it was only in the United States, no slavery. That doesn't mean anything. You know, and I'm talking about people who were at university studying history. You know, I think it's important as well to talk about the current context. You know, there are a lot of tensions in Europe. There's the extreme right wing that is gaining popularity. But then, you know, there's the message about importance. Colonialization was a long time ago. My grandmother was born before it. I don't agree. I'm not sure whether, you know, we want to be in a space where we can't have any tensions. Most people in the general public are not familiar with this history. You know, the problems were already there. We didn't create them. They're reflected off us. And people are saying, you know, that we have these tensions, but they don't understand their own history. So we're in a situation where, so this is the Afropean making a lot of noise again. As we're demonstrating these situations, we're talking about these situations, I think things are changing. There are teachers who are making an effort, and thanks to the media, thanks to alternative media, you know, there are alternative histories, more complete histories, let's say. But there's a misunderstanding of that, of the tensions. People don't understand them properly. Are you familiar with the history of Cameroon? And it's, you know, when it was decolonized, people, when you talk to them about it, they thought it was all peaceful, that there was only a problem in Algeria. So what do we do about that? You know, especially because it's not even finished, is it, this decolonialization? Yeah, that's true. We should talk about how the colony inherited power. Yeah, so we're still talking about colonialism today in Africa. Yes, that's yet another debate. I can't wait not to be subject to those tensions, because I'm somebody who's very joyful in spite of all that. I love life to the full. And so these questions, I experience them. Well, things have calmed down, but when I think about them, it makes me cross. Why are we in this situation where I have to worry about things like that? The reality is that many people, like many black people, you know, they'd like to do something else with their life. So much time wasted, so many poems not written because I was so cross about racialism and sexism. Very well. Thank you. I think there's a question. Yes, there is a question at the back there.
Oui, il y avait une remarque sur.
Yes, there was a remark about the Roman Empire earlier on. I think that what's important to say is why whiteness was created, what the aim of that was, what the material and economic aim was. Because the Romans were certainly not all white. There were emperors who were clearly not white at all. But, you know, what changed in between time? Why did we create race? Why did we racialize black people? Today, that's the kind of question that we're asking ourselves. So I think there's really a kind of materialistic angle that we need to explore. What is the purpose of the racialization of certain groups? And I'm not just referring to a world with a white majority. I'm also referring to a world, you know, it's something that you see in Japan as well. In India, you know, the caste system in India. So with respect to racialization, you know, what is the economic center of interest? That's my remark.
Voilà. Une réaction par rapport à ça?
Okay, would anybody like to react to that? Well, when we talk about the black experience, it's impossible not to talk about whiteness. You know, how whiteness is resting on, you know, the fact of making other human beings inferior. You know, power, economic power notably, and it's continuing today. So it's a power regime, whiteness. It's a system of domination. What else can I say? I have the impression that the question it's more related to. Let me take a simple example. When we're discriminated against in a recruitment situation, we have fewer resources. The person who has an advantage because they're not black, they're white, that person has more resources. If you find it more difficult to find work, then you find it more difficult to accumulate resources. I don't know whether that's what you wanted to say, even if it's a different example. I'm afraid the person is speaking again, but off microphone. So that's what you mean, isn't it? Racialization is a strategy to grab resources. I'm sorry, without a microphone, we can't hear the gentleman speaking. I'm sorry, without a microphone, we can't hear the gentleman speaking. The gentleman is not speaking into a microphone. Can we ask the gentleman to use a microphone, or somebody give him a microphone?
Merci.
Thank you. Why was racialization created? And what about the transatlantic slave trade? How is it justified? What were the gains for the United States? They're continuing to benefit from that fruit materialistically. And other former colonial powers. Sweden got money for having ceded a country to France. So if we want to create synergy between different communities and within the black community, but not just within the North African community, we need to think about the fact that racialization is something that's material, but, you know, how do we become white? Why did Armenians become white? Why the Maronite Lebanese became white? Negritude, maybe I'm wrong, but I think, well, I don't know actually. I'm not familiar with this subject. Are Armenians white in all contexts? It's not, are they white? White means, do they have the power? Yes, exactly. For example, in the Franco-French context, or the American context, Armenians are white. However, in Turkey, they're not white. So, well, let's just go back to the question of Afropeans and the discrimination, the language of discrimination, which affects our ability to talk about our stories. If I may, I think it's interesting because this question of discrimination it's the question of economic marginalization. And so it makes it a lot more difficult to underline the value of Afropeans. That's why we have platforms that are really good. Your platform, Marie-Julie. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to move via these marginal spaces because discrimination organizes the impossibility of having access to broader resources. Do you know what I mean? It makes sense what I'm saying. I think it's important to say this, you know, when we talk about Afropean narratives, we're talking about narratives that are marginalized. It's not just marginalized by chance. You know, it's a question of exclusion. Okay. Very good.
Deuxième intervention? Non.
Bon, merci.
Thank you. I just want to make a remark. Earlier on, you talked about Black Lives Matter. I think that most of the world population that recognizes itself through this action, you know, the idea of respect, of representing minorities, generally speaking, that's become a symbol. Martin Luther King is one example. I just wanted to make that remark, to say that the subjects of discrimination, you know, they might be linked to skin, but they're linked to society. Martin Luther King, what he did was an example of a good change. And concerning mixed race, the mixed race question, for me, it creates wealth to be able to identify yourself as an Afropean. It means that you've got a dual culture. That's something that's very positive. What's missing, perhaps, is, you know, encouraging young people today through education to be inspired by people like you. You know, give them the legitimacy to go beyond. And it's the idea of, you know, making sure that reactions aren't just linked to color, you know, through what is said. Thank you very much. So I think we will now close the debate. Thank you, Marie-Julie, Kiyémis. Thank you, everybody.